We're continuing our look at the life of David. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 18 today. And it's one of those passages, I'm just going to speak candidly, kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit. And some of you are like, we don't want to see behind your curtain, man. Just do your thing. Preparing to speak on a passage, some feel to me more difficult than others, and this is one of those ones that's got a unique challenge because it's narrative and it's a really the story just sort of tells itself, and so there's a sense in which it's like, well, just read it, there you go. It's like, well, I'm supposed to do more than that. And so but there are things I think in this for us to learn, but it can be one of those things where it's maybe difficult to pull out parallels because it's talking about a battle that King David, the king of Israel, is fighting against his son who's trying to seize the throne. This is difficult for most of us to relate to, right? I mean, maybe you're like, well, I had a business and my son is trying to take... Okay, maybe there's parallels, but that's not the same as this. But there are things that I think we can see in here, and as I was thinking about this, I thought, you know what, this kind of comes down to a question, I think, that gets settled in this chapter a little bit, and that is basically, whose kingdom is it? When we're talking in the context of the story, we're talking about ancient Israel, so we know the right answer is it's God's kingdom, right? He anointed David to be king, but it's God's kingdom. Okay, we understand that's true, by the way. If you're like, that was my answer, is that the right answer? It was, correct. You're right. You can mark that right. But when we think about our own lives, to not I don't want to stretch this into an analogy. It isn't. It's historical narrative. But we all kind of have kingdoms, right? We have areas of influence in our lives. We have our stuff, whether it's our family or we own a business or we have some kind of authority or position somewhere. We all have something that is like a kingdom. It could be your followers on social media, whichever current platform is winning. We all have, and I mean, even you could say a church could be seen as that. And so a lead pastor of a church could be tempted to stop thinking of this as, well, it's God's church. Well, this is my church, right? Pastors do this sometimes. We're not trying to lead each other into temptation, but you get a bunch of pastors together at a conference how are things going at your church? How many people come to your church? Your church is doing 2 services on a Sunday. How many people come to your church, kind of thing, right? It's almost like we're not trying to compare, but we do. It's like, well, how do you score that kind of thing? It's like, why are it's like, yeah, this is our church, but we're part of the big picture church. Whose kingdom is it? The right answer is always, it's God's kingdom. Whatever endeavor a human wants to set themselves to, whether it's a single family, like a home and kids, that kind of almost microcosm, to building a business, establishing a literal nation or kingdom, any of those kind of things, a team, the people that work in an office, any of those things that can be said, this is an area of influence with someone in command. They're all derivative kingdoms. There's always someone higher up, and not just, oh, you mean my boss, and then the vice president and the president, the owner of the company. It's like everything in this world is under the rightful rule of God, who made it and rules all things. And that was very clearly established in the nation of Israel, where God, right from the start, said, I'm going to establish a people, and I'm going to show what this looks like. It's not about, who has the mightiest king and the best army, and this idea that, well, this king, in this nation, they've got these idols and these gods that they worship, and if I go, if that king comes and fights against this country and wins, that king might say, oh, look, our gods are more mighty than yours, but it tends to be the glory of that king. And Israel was supposed to be different. And we saw, we've been looking at the life of David for years, literally, off and on. And we know that he's the second king of Israel. The first king of Israel, Saul, that's kind of, at risk of oversimplifying, where he went wrong, right? God anointed him king of his people, and he's honored at first. But then he very quickly starts to see it as, well, this is my kingdom, these are my people, and he's out for his glory. And so anything that threatens him, and he holds tighter and tighter, and God rejects him. And so now we see this situation where David is the king, but he's not on the throne. He is across the Jordan River because his, at this point, eldest son Absalom has declared himself king and is trying to seize the throne from his father, right? One of those, like, you're next in line, but dad's taking his time dying, so I just want to hurry it along a little bit. He figures this is his time. And so we've been reading over the last number of weeks how he, Absalom was laying this scheme and he's put it into practice. David has fled. And now it comes down to this battle for the throne, but it's not just a battle between two people claiming to be the king. Who's going to win in this battle so that they actually get to be the king? It's kind of a battle between those two different ways of looking at a kingdom. Is this just a kingdom of a person, David's kingdom, Absalom's kingdom, or is this the kingdom of God? It plays out here in what we're going to see as a painful victory for David in 2 Samuel 18. So I'm going to just read through it in a few different pieces because the story sort of flows. So if you've got a Bible or a Bible app, you can turn there to 2 Samuel chapter 18. Starting at verse 1, it says, "Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, and 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out. For if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it's better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom." So this represents kind of a change in David's pattern of behavior. When he learned that Absalom had declared himself king in Hebron, the first thing he did was say, okay, we need to leave. And he left. And he seemed to be going out of his way to not defend his throne, gather an army, steal resources. He's sending people back into the city while he flees. And we've been looking at over the last number of weeks how God really preserved him, kept him safe. There was a bit of a spy game happening here with an intelligence network, but we saw God's hand at work in that. So David has found himself in this walled city called, is it Menahem, on the other side of the river, and Absalom's forces have followed, and now David has stopped running. Now David is doing military things. He organizes the people with him into an army. He sets commanders over them, puts like a structure. Those terms where he says he sets over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, those are not, apparently not necessarily like literally, they're like ranks. Right? Like he broke them into units and battalions and whatever. There was a structure, and it all came down to these three commanders. I guess there's three big divisions in his army. Joab, his brother Abishai, we know these guys, and then Ittai the Gittite, who we talked about a few weeks ago. He's not even Israelite. He's a Philistine. But he's been a faithful friend of David since David was fugitive from Saul. So Ittai and his team of apparently very dangerous fighters, he came with David, and so David has given him kind of an official commanding post in this made-up kind of army, improvised army that he has. So why did David stop running? I think there's a couple of reasons. This is not, I think it's very clear in what's come up to it and what follows this. This isn't David going, enough. I've been gracious, I've been nice, I've been patient, but enough is enough. He's not, there's none of that sense of I've turned the other cheek, but I've run out of cheeks, now it's time to put up our dukes kind of thing. I think he's accomplished, like David's working on a different sort of checklist. One of the main things we saw the first thing when David was told, Absalom has declared himself king in Hebron, he's coming this way. David says, we have to leave immediately unless Absalom comes and he'll put the city to the sword. David seemed very concerned for the safety of just the citizens in Jerusalem. It's like if Absalom comes and I'm still here and there's like a defense that happens, there's going to be essentially a civil war and all kinds of people in Jerusalem are going to get injured. We need to go. But now he's on the other side of the Jordan. The people, the regular non-military kind of civilian population of Jerusalem, they're fine. The people that have followed David are those officers and members of his court that are loyal to him, his family, these Philistine and other kind of mercenaries that he's got. So there were probably some army units. We know Joab and Abishai have followed him. But these are people who are loyal to David, and they are more or less part of the military structure. But I think bigger picture, we've seen this attitude in David while he has been fleeing. David didn't suddenly lose his nerve, right? Like when he's young, he's defending his sheep against lions and bears, like with a stick. And then when he's a little bit bigger, he's killing big armed and armored giants with rocks. And now suddenly he's like, oh, my son is coming. Oh, that's going to get messy. Let's go. I guess he gets the kingdom. It was a good run, guys. He's not suddenly lost his spine. But we remember in context, David sinned horribly. He had a lapse, and he started using his authority. He started seeing the kingdom as his kingdom, not God's. And we looked at this months ago, and it's the well-known story, right? He ends up essentially compelling a married woman to have an affair with him, and then murders her husband to cover it up. And thinks he could get away with it because kings can do that kind of thing, right? When I say don't ask any questions, you don't ask questions. If I need a guy to die in battle, he can die in battle. I'm the king. Except God saw, right? And God confronted him through the words of a prophet. And David was contrite, he was repentant, but he understands that there's going to be calamity coming for him. And no, God said, your life is not going to be required of you because you've sinned. But the sword will never depart from your house. I'm going to raise up calamity with you from within your own family. There's going to be these things happening. And so David sees, look, this is God's kingdom. And as his employee, right? As his middle manager, as his hired representative, I colored outside the lines. I absconded with company funds. I was acting like I owned this stuff instead of just being a steward of it. And the boss saw, and he's upset. So do I still have the job? Do I still have the kingdom? Suddenly Absalom, someone from within my own family has risen up against me. He's bringing, weapons to the city. It's like, okay. And so as he's walking out of town, right, we heard him say things like, don't bring the Ark of the Covenant out, guys. Bring that back. I don't know if God's going to be favorable to me. If he shows me kindness, he'll bring me back to Jerusalem and put me on the throne and I'll see the Ark. But if he doesn't, keep it there. And so David, I think, clearly sees this is just part of it. This is where I'm going to see if God is going to keep me on the throne, restore me to his throne, or not. Absalom sees this different, right? This is where, am I going to seize the throne for myself from David, my father, who currently has the throne? Which of these ideologies is going to win? So David sets his men together and he sends them out. And we see that he himself plans to lead them into battle, but the men strongly disagree. He relents, right? I'm going to go out, and they're like, that's a horrible plan. You're the guy they want. If they're they won't care if they get they could be killing all of us. We could retreat. They're just going to get you. Stay in the city. And he says, okay. And that is sound strategy. And some commentators say even that David stating, I will go out with you, and them saying, no, you stay, may have been almost more of a formality. David's no dummy. He understands that that's sound strategy. For him to be out there is going to be, he's a liability on the battlefield in this case. And it's interesting when we were reading how Absalom had these counselors with him giving him advice, and God used Hushai to basically give him a bad plan. The smart counselor, Ahithophel, told him, you stay in Jerusalem and send an army out to get David and bring him back. You stay here, right? He knew it was a good plan. David knows it's a good plan. Interestingly, the fact that Absalom is in this battle seems to suggest that he did in fact continue to carry out Hushai's plan, which may have been driven by ego or strategy or whatnot. But we see that David's sending them out, and very clearly he gives these clear instructions to his commanders. He says, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. That's unexpected language, right? The young man Absalom is also the usurper, the rebel who is trying to seize the throne, right? He is the end boss in this game. He's the bad guy. Deal gently with the young man. He's just my son. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He's not a boy at this point. He's a grown-up, Absalom is. But he basically tells them all, essentially, take him alive if possible. Show mercy to him. Don't slaughter everyone and him too, thinking that you're doing me a favor. That's not this kind of fight. Partly because you're fighting against your own countrymen, right? This is the army of Israel against the army of Israel. But deal gently with Absalom, and everyone heard him say it. So then we see the battle unfolding in verses 6 to 18. And we'll look at it in a couple of sections. First, there's an overview of the whole event we see in verses 6 to 8. It says, so the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. That's interesting. As I say, this is kind of like a prologue or an overview, and it sort of gives, okay, spoiler alert, David's team wins. It was a big battle. David's forces won. The army of Israel that was following Absalom took heavy losses, and then you get this mysterious, captivating verse. Right? The forest devoured more people that day than the sword. Man, I wish he had unpacked. What do you mean? Were there bears? Quicksand? Angry trees? Is it like ants that are, what is, what's going on? It's obviously figurative language, right? But I'm I wanted to see, that would make a cool movie scene. Okay? The people afterwards escaping back to Jerusalem, how was the battle? Oh man, don't even talk to me about it. And they're like, okay, and they're freaking out at your house plants, right? Because anyway, sorry, this is a rabbit trail none of you paid for. I think the commentators are so boring, right? They're very likely what it means is, because we're not entirely sure where this geographic location, right? The forest of Ephraim, where, obviously the terrain has changed a little bit in the thousands of years. But they're very likely David's forces were smaller, and these are all people who are experienced in kind of highly mobile, asymmetrical guerrilla warfare, whereas the regular drafted army that Absalom would have is maybe more used to formation fighting that is used on open they're not used to improvising. And so the terrain, the treacherous, broken terrain, the amount of cover that was there was exploited by David's army. Maybe. Okay, that's boring though. I'm thinking carnivorous trees, but it's not in the Bible, so I'm not going to preach that. But we see that David's team was winning. Then we get to the meat of it here in verses 9 to 15, where we see what happened to Absalom. It says, and Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Just want to pause. That's just happened to. Was in the area. He's obviously on the field and he's in battle. Maybe it wasn't a direct attack. Maybe he was retreating. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, and Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, what, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt, which was a big deal then, I think. We'll get there. But the man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand, and he thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And then 10 young men, Absalom's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So here we have a detailed example of one of the forest's victims, this famous scene of Absalom getting caught in a tree and hanging there, in the somewhat painful, frightening, and probably embarrassing experience of the mule keeps going and he's stuck. Now, I've seen pictures of this in Bible storybooks. I have several funny stories related to this that my clock says, don't do them, maybe next service. It doesn't implicitly say that his long hair that he was so proud of is what got caught in the tree. I think it's probably pretty likely, right? Like, if he was riding under a tree and like, he got his neck caught in something, he's probably like, you're dead, right? Like, I saw him impaled on a tree. No, he was hanging there alive. We know he had long flowing hair that was a matter of pride for him. And so here he is, the tree is bringing about his demise. It's caught him. And we get this unnamed soldier refusing to kill the prince because of David's orders. Now, this weird thing where Joab is like, why didn't you kill him? I would have had to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. Some translations say a warrior's belt, which I'm assuming has a big belt buckle. I don't know, Texas style or something. We don't know. That may have been a standard known reward for killing an enemy officer, or maybe it was a bounty that Joab had announced to his men. It seems to be like something this man should have known. It's like, why didn't you do it? You know what the prize is, and it's not insignificant. It just sounds funny, throwing in the belt. It's like, were these super rare? I don't know, but the bottom line is the man's like, look, as cool as that is, and it seems to imply some rank, right? If you're wearing that belt, it's like you got medals or a special patch. Everyone knows that you took out an important. He's like, I don't care what, even if, forget the promise of a belt when we get home. If you handed me a bag with 1,000, I could feel the weight of them. I wouldn't do it because listen, we know you were told not to. And then he says this, and the translation I'm using is a little clunky to read, but I think you caught it, right? He says, if I had disobeyed the king and killed Absalom, the king's going to find out, the implication being, and he's going to be upset because he clearly told us not to kill Absalom if we can help it. He's like, you're talking now like, oh, you would give me this great reward and you'd honor me. But I know, Joab, if the king found out and he was mad, you'd throw me under the bus. You'd be like, it was him, not me. I don't know. It was this guy. Talk to the guy with the fancy belt. Oh, you got your belt. And he'd be like, what? Joab, you said. He's like, I don't even know this guy's name. His name isn't even in the Bible, Dave. I don't know what's going on, right? So this guy knows, and that's interesting, right? Because this is one of those glimpses where you've got an interaction between two people. We don't know all the details of their life, but this soldier is making some assumptions about what Joab would do. So that tells us some things that are likely true about Joab's character. He had a reputation. It seems that Joab, part of his reputation is he seems to see people as less important than goals. Yeah, this needs to happen, and so you get a belt, or maybe you get executed. I don't really care. And Joab also seems to see ethical discussions. Let's debate about whether this is the right thing to do. He sees those as a waste of time when he's in a crisis, right? This guy's weighing that out, and Joab doesn't argue with him. Just say, I would never do that. I would stand by you. What's your name, Carl? Carl. I would stand by you, Carl, right to the end. He's like, I'm not wasting my time. Give me these spears, right? Discussing the rightness or wrongness of an action in Joab's mind is a waste of time when the thing is very clear to do. I wonder, some people maybe by wiring are a little bit like that, but I think that's a dangerous spot to be in. I know people that seem to operate like that. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you know people like that. But anyway, we see that Joab ignores David's orders in pursuit of what Joab saw as best for the kingdom. And he's not an idiot, right? He's like, look, this is all kinds of trouble. This isn't just a foreign enemy attacking. This is the king's son dividing the whole country. And he's been sneaky, right? He connived his way. He used me to get him back into Jerusalem. And then he wanted to get right back into the court, and he's dividing it. Like, we need to take this guy out for the good of the country. Joab's not technically wrong in his tactical assessment, except he was under direct commands, and he tosses that. We've seen him do this before. In 2 Samuel 3, he kills an enemy commander named Abner, who was under terms of peace at that point, but he's like, you know what? We just got to get this moving. We need to solve the problem and move the agenda along. Murder is technically wrong, but, he's one of those guys. So then we see the aftermath of the battle. It says, then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom, and they threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. So he called the pillar after his own name, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. So we see the aftermath. Joab blew the trumpet, David's troops came back, Absalom's troops fled to their own homes. And then we see Absalom's body, very interestingly, right? It's not brought to David. It's not preserved to be brought back to Jerusalem. It is treated very much like an enemy general's body would be treated. According to historians, it wouldn't be unusual if they were fighting against, Moabites or Philistines or something to do that. But this is still Joab's operation, and so Absalom's body is thrown into a large pit. In the language used, there's a bit of an ironic reference, because it's the same word for pit or cave that was used when in the last chapter, in chapter 17, verse 9, when Hushai is giving advice to Absalom, and it's bad advice, right? He's trying to trip up his plans, and he goes, your father isn't camped with the troops. He's hiding in some cave or pit somewhere in the forest. Ironically, it's and Absalom that's where he ends up. And there's also the very sad contrast between the monument that Absalom built for himself in the Valley of the Kings, probably beside Jerusalem, and the large heap of stones that came to actually mark his place, this kind of just heap of rocks in the forest. In 2 Samuel 14:27, it says that Absalom had 3 sons. But the fact that they weren't named, and you combine that with this passage that says, I have no son to carry on my name, very likely these sons died when they were very young. But we see that in his attempt to build a legacy for himself, I'm going to seize the kingdom, I'm going to make this monument, I've got to do something, right? He wants to establish the bigness of his kingdom. He ends up here, buried under a pile of rocks in a pit or cave in the forest. I think there is a sad parallel here to our own lives very much of the time, right? As we try to build our own little kingdoms, establish our own legacy, The story is cliche. We read it in books and we see it in movies, and many of us have either experienced or we know people in our lives who chase a version of this, right? Where they tend to ignore the things that later they realize are important, and they just pursue, their career, their promotion, their expanded power, their wealth, whatever their arena of choice is. They pursue that. And when we try to build our own kingdom, it proves hollow, right? This monument that Absalom built that's recorded here, we don't know where this pillar is. There is a pillar near Jerusalem, and it's called Absalom's monument. Actually, there's a picture of it on the front of the bulletin. But the historical consensus is that can't be this one. It was built much too late. It's probably like 1st century AD. So it was built, and they're like, well, it's like pseudo-history happening. But we don't know where his pillar is. We don't know where his grave is. Everything Absalom built has been lost. And so I think that's a lesson to us, right? When we try to seize what we think we deserve, rather than seeing it as God's kingdom and what would he have me do, it's like, no, this is mine and I'm going to grab it. We might think we're building a monument to our legacy, and we will end up with a handful of sand or a big pile of rocks. Last section here, and my clock says I should have been here 4 minutes ago, so we'll pedal quickly. But we see the aftermath with David. So the first part in verses 19 to 23, it's a discussion about whose news is this to share. It says, then Ahimaaz the son of Zadok said, let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you are not to carry the news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, you go and tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz the son of Zadok said again to Joab, come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? Come what may, he said, I will run. So he said to him, okay, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and he outran the Cushite. Kind of an odd section, right? Ahimaaz really wants to run with this news. There's probably lots that we don't see here. Some people just really like to be the one to tell the news, even if it's not their story to tell. I don't think that's the case here. I think there's probably lots of reasons why he's really eager to run. Could be new shoes, but I suspect that there's a certain honor that comes with the one that gets to bring the good news. We're going to see in the next few verses, and there's a couple of other spots in the Old Testament where there's this passing reference to the idea that when you see a messenger coming, if you know who that messenger is, that person's character, their reputation, their status is a good indicator of the kind of news that they're bringing. It's kind of like you don't send good news through a servant, and you don't send bad news through someone who has a good reputation. Ahimaaz sees this as good news, and he wants to be the one. He's maybe got a bit of ambition. He knows that he's a fast runner. Maybe he's earned it, right? Because he was one of the guys that ran with the news from Jerusalem to David, right? With the stuff from Hushai, and it's like, please cross the river now, because this is what's happening. He's like, I'm good at this kind of thing. Maybe he's trying to build up his brand as the messenger of choice. He's clearly fast. He wants to do it. There's a question, though, of whether Ahimaaz knew that Absalom was actually dead or not. There's in what verse is it? 20, where it says, and Joab said to him, you are not to carry the news today. You may carry news another day, but today you'll carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Apparently, that because the king's son is dead may or may not be sort of a parenthetical comment that the narrator would say. It's kind of like, Joab said, you shall carry no news today. And then he would say to the reader, he said this because he knew the king's son was dead. If that's the kind of thing, maybe Ahimaaz didn't know. Maybe he wasn't there when all of that happened. We know that things happen quickly. Joab blows the trumpet. The troops are coming back. It's woods. It took them a while to get there. Meanwhile, throw this guy in the hole. Maybe Ahimaaz didn't know. And that's why he saw this just as good news. Maybe he did know, but he sees it kind of cut and dry. Maybe a little bit like Joab. It's like, yeah, Absalom's the king's son, but come on, he's trying to seize his throne. I'm pretty sure any kind of parental love here is gone. But he heard David's orders to be merciful, so there's a bit of a mystery. At any rate, Joab says, don't do it today. And he sends the Cushite, another nameless guy who's just identified by his tribe or his nationality. The trick is there are 2 or 3 groups that would have been called this. I think the point is that this guy is a foreigner and quite possibly a slave. So Joab sends someone with a lower reputation. He's not even named. So that's weird, right? It's like, this is good news. We've won. The Lord has delivered you out of the hands of your enemies. Good news. I'm going to send a foreign slave who is of less reputation and also maybe more expendable. If David really takes it hard and shoots the messenger, it's like Joab doesn't want Ahimaaz to fall under that. Ahimaaz seems to not understand, right? So he argues back and forth. Finally, Joab says, okay, go ahead. I think he figures first guy's got enough of a head start, right? He doesn't know Ahimaaz is like Hot Wheels, man. He beats them. He outruns them, overtakes them. So then meanwhile, back in Mahanaim, right, David's waiting at the city. We read in verse 24, it says, now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king. And the king said, if he's alone, then there is news in his mouth. And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gate and said, see, another man running alone. The king said, he also brings news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first man is like the running of Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. And the king said, he's a good man. He comes with good news. This is kind of a weird, very repetitive little piece to read, right? It cuts from the scene of the battle in the forest. Here's David with probably minimal staff and the women and children in the city, and he's talking with the watchman. And David is very eagerly awaiting the news, right? He's not in the most armored, protected, like, in the tower, in the castle, in the middle of the walled city. He's near the gate. There's kind of like a double wall system, and he's like in between. And there's a watchman up on top, and he's calling down what he sees. David is like right there. He wants to get the news. And the recorded conversation with the watchman, David seems to be like, oh, he's running alone? That must mean news. That's news. Oh, now there's 2 of them? Oh, okay, well, that's news as well. 1 is news, 2 is news. Oh, it's Ahimaaz. He's a good guy. Oh, that'll be good news. It's like, just give me the news. Like, get the guy here. And he does seem to have that idea that if it's a good man, if Joab has sent Ahimaaz, he's a good guy, it's going to be good news. That's kind of the understanding. And it seems like Ahimaaz was well known as a runner, right? If he could be recognized just from his form. Like I said, maybe he's building his brand as a reputation. We don't know. At any rate, Ahimaaz outran the Cushite and gets to Mahanaim first, and we see what happens here in verse 28. It says, then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, all is well. And he bowed down before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. And the king said, is it well with the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. The king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would I have died instead of you? Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Not probably what the Cushite was expecting. Probably a surprise for Ahimaaz too. Right? Ahimaaz arrives first. despite the other guy's head start. He delivers the triumphant response, but the king's immediate reaction is to ask a specific question, and he doesn't say, "Did you kill that dirtbag?" Yeah, it's like, "Is he safe?" It's like, oh, that's, Maybe it's in that moment that Ahimaaz realizes that piece of news is not good news. He's not the one to deliver that. Whether he is honestly ignorant, where he's like, "Well, I didn't get that specific detail. There was a big commotion. I'm assuming it's all good." Like, "Did you hear the part about how God has given you the victory, sir?" He doesn't answer. The Cushite comes, and I think he either can't read the room, or he just sees it all as good news, or he's just doing his job, and he delivers the news well, right? He uses this euphemistic language, clearly giving glory to God, right? Is the young man Absalom okay? It's like, no, you know what? I hope all your enemies end up like that guy, right? The implication is, nope, he's gone. And David's response is this bitter grief. He is inconsolable at the death of his son. His son, who was leading an army against David, an army of his own countrymen. He was a rebel. So we're left with this tragic picture, and with this I'm done. We get this picture of the rightful king having successfully defended his throne from the rebellious usurper, and he's weeping because the rebel was his beloved son. And while the king was right? He knows that the rebel's evil plan had to be stopped. He cries over and over again, "Oh, my son, if I could have died instead of you. Oh, would I had died instead of you, my son, my son." And so his victory as a king is overshadowed by his grief as a compassionate father who wishes he could have somehow died in the place of his rebellious son. This is a picture of the gospel from an angle we don't often see. I don't know about you, but for me, I think it is a lot easier when I think about God to think of him as powerful and mighty and unchallenged, like a king. And then it's easier for me to think of him like that than to think of him as a father who loves his children and honestly grieves over the death that our sin has caused us. Absalom's death he did it to himself. It was his own rebellion that brought it about. But it's easier for me to see God as a king that would have been fine, he got what he deserved, than, "Oh, my son, if only I could have died in your place." But that is the kind of father that God is. David is known, and it's said a couple of times in Scripture, that David was a man after God's own heart. And I think David was never more clearly a man after God's own heart than he is in this scene, when he cries out that he wishes he could have died in the place of his rebellious son. David couldn't do that. It would be impossible for him, but God can, and God did. God the Father and King loves us, his rebellious, throne-seeking, kingdom-stealing, monument-building children. And he loves us so much that he came in the person of his son Jesus to actually die instead of you and instead of me. The rebellion of sin against the righteous king was put down that day when the son of the king hung from a tree, when a spear pierced his side. When he died, sin died with him. And when he was placed in a hole in the ground with a big stone piled above him, our sin was buried too. And now we can be forgiven. We can be made right with God. We can be made right with the king that we've rebelled against. We can be brought near, brought back into the kingdom, even as part of his family. The kind of redemption that Absalom wanted, but his motives were never quite right, but we can have that. We're brought near not with hearts that are just still looking for a sneaky way to claim the throne for ourselves, but with hearts that are made new in him, that glory in the kingship of our Father, that recognize it was never about me anyway. So I guess the question is, have you seen the rebellion in your heart? Have you seen the futility and wrongheadedness of trying to be your own God, build your own kingdom, trying to seize his throne, essentially? Have you seen his love for you? even in the face of our sin, that would far rather die in our place than to have his victory without us. God longs to have rebels back home. He longs to forgive, and he can, because the death that we owe was already paid by the God who loves us. So don't continue pretending to be your own king or your own queen. Stop trying to build monuments to yourself in this life. All we end up with is a hole in the ground and a pile of stones. Hear the cry of the Father's heart, who would rather die in the place of his rebellious children. I implore you, put your faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Ask God to forgive you and make you clean. Ask him to pierce your rebellious heart and give you a new one. Ask him for the life that Jesus' death secured for you, and walk in peace with the Father who loves us so much. Let's pray. Gracious Lord, we do thank you for your love for us. And we thank you for the glimpse that we have in this story. The glimpse that helps us to see you as a father. It helps us to see when we sin against you, and essentially anything we do that rebels and wants us to be the king of our life instead of submitting to you is that kind of rebellious sin. It helps us to see it not merely as a crime against some great and distant king. Technically we broke the law, but we see it as just a pain in the heart of a father who loves us. And we also see the compassion that moved your heart to set in motion your plan of salvation. Lord, we thank you for what you did for us on the cross. I thank you for the salvation, the forgiveness, the restoration that you offer us. Lord, I pray that you would move our hearts to value it more and more. And if there are those in this place or listening online and they haven't bowed their knee to you, maybe they're looking to come alongside to see how you can help them build their kingdom, but they haven't crossed that line where they realize it's not their kingdom at all, it's yours. Lord, I pray that you would move their hearts and open their eyes to their need for grace, and that you would turn their hearts to you today. In Jesus' name.